you doing?
I'm doing all right. Leila Taiba, everybody, and it's nice to be here. I just want to, in perfect Arabic style, give a very long thank you to everybody that's involved. All this, it's not just how well organized everything is, but it's the sort of the authenticity of the welcome is just delightful. It's been so wonderful. And all the people involved, the people that I know and the people that I don't know, the people who are serving the drinks, the people who are taking the pictures, the guy that's sitting outside at the entrance, the person that put this up, the whole thing. Thank you so much. It's wonderful, not only for what it does to, yes, absolutely, yeah. Not only because it's delightful to us writers and my fellow shipmates here, but also what it says about literature, I think, and valuing literature. It's such a wonderful thing. So I commend you and thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad you started like that, because, by the way, we had a bit of a chat yesterday for about 10, 15 minutes, and we thought, let's keep this spontaneous, okay? So this might go in many different directions. We'll just see how it goes. But I'm glad you started by referencing the whole festival and organization and everything, because one of the things I like about the festival myself is that, yeah, apart from the authenticity of the thing, every year, though, I'm struck by the many different meanings. This is the Mediterranean Literature Festival, right? And listening to all the different readings that happen on any given night, I can't help but be struck by the many different senses in which the Mediterranean, that the word Mediterranean has acquired. And so I thought I'd begin by asking you, since your origins are in Libya, you grew up partly in Libya and then in Cairo and then moved around a fair bit, right? Coming here, do you have a sense of familiarity? Does this Mediterranean, what you've seen of it anyway, look familiar to you? Does it feel like home, or does it look different on the other shore?
No, in fact, anywhere I go in the Mediterranean, something about all the obvious things that we know, the palette of the colors, the smells, provoke me in ways that are purely subjective. And I think it's to do with the fact that when we are very young, those very early experiences when we're children, when the disease of comparison sets in, when you live amongst your family, and according to your consciousness, it is the only family in the world. Until your friend invites you to his home and you discover there's another set of parents and another way to organize life and furniture and priorities and ways of engaging. And that is the moment, I think, when the disease of comparison sets in, and you're never really the same ever again. But at those early moments, being by that landscape and starting to sense that thing that I think we all in childhood sense, which is the moment when we really feel our singularity, when we feel that there are certain things that we are feeling and thinking and responding to that are essential to us, that maybe we're not quite sure whether anyone else shares them. We don't even have language for them. Those early moments, wherever you spend them, in whatever landscape you spend them, that landscape, I think, then always holds keys to that space. So whenever I'm here, things are being awakened and provoked in me that are very deep, and they are just purely subjective.
I wonder if I can share a memory with you, because you've just reminded me of this. Some time ago, I was in Tripoli. This was the first time I'd visited Tripoli, and I was staying in a hotel called Bab al-Bahar, which was right on the shore, on the beach. This was actually just weeks before the United States declared war on Iraq. So I actually watched Colin Powell's Security Council presentation from my hotel room in Tripoli, and then I was a bit upset, so I walked out and went for a long walk along the shore. And I remember being struck every time I walked along beach in Tripoli by the quality of the light. There was a whiteness to it, which was familiar, but not quite the same as what I get here, right? And this was winter, but nevertheless, you know, there was that quality. And then, not long after that, I came across your first novel, In the Country of Men, which opens, its opening paragraphs describe the white of everything. That's the way you put it. That's your phrase, right? The white of everything, this merciless white, because this is summer you're talking about. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of the sense I got. And it looked different from the other shore, but at the same time, it wasn't. It was the same thing, but different. I don't know if I'm making any sense here.
No, absolutely. There's something essential, to that light in every place. But there are some common grounds. But the light in Tripoli is, it's a light that is screaming for a painter. You know, it's a very unique light. I'm slightly reserved about essentializing my place. You know, exiles have this disease of always talking about, the light back home, the breeze, the sea, And I've always cringed about that because I don't, because sentimentality in a way is a way of abstracting something, obscuring it, I think. But when I went back for the first time in 33 years, it was hard not to feel that, yes, there's something really unique about the light there. The way that it doesn't so much fall on something, but it seems to almost hold the objects. Certainly I felt held by it. And it's stunning. It's beautiful, yeah.
You just mentioned the word exile, and we'll maybe talk a bit more about that later on. But despite the fact that you've described yourself as an exile, and exile seems to me to be a recurrent theme in your work, there is nevertheless always a very strong sense of place. The description of the geography, the location where things happen, even though things do happen in many different ways. For example, in Anatomy of a Disappearance, which I think we're going to hear a reading from in maybe a minute or two, right? The story does move in different places as the narrator moves, but nevertheless, the sense of place is always extremely strong. Is location something you consciously work into your fiction, or is that just something that just happens without you needing to sort of think too hard about it?
No, it's not. It's not conscious. For me, writing is a way of really. It exposes me. I think all writing exposes the writer. You don't even know your obsessions. You don't even know the things, how you really feel about something, until you write it, I think. I'm always sometimes taken aback when I read a book after finishing it by my focus on particular things. Having said that, I don't think I can read my own work. I don't think writers can read their own work. There's a fogged space that exists between the work and the writer. And I think there's a mercy in that, because sometimes I think, what if you can actually objectively read your own work? and then you discover that all the options are bad. It seems to me like if you think it's good, then you're one of those terrible people who walks around saying, my work is really good. Or if you think it's not good, then it's only, as a writer, you exist in a different space. You're a servant as far as I'm concerned. You're really making yourself available for the work, and you keep your ear very close to the ground, and you're always trying to be as attentive as possible to it. You're waiting for it to tell you what it is that it wants. It's the closest that at least somebody totally unenlightened like me gets to being selfless, in a sense, because you really are forced to put aside all of your opinions, all of your causes, all of your personal, views in a sense, and instead give over to the work. If the work rejects something, then it rejects it. You can't force it into it. And this was I remember in my second book, An Anatomy of a Disappearance, there were about 30 pages that I thought, given the fact that I can't read my own work, but myself, my first reader, my wife, who's a very good reader, and my agent, all three of us thought this possibly is the best 30 pages I've ever written. But they didn't belong in the book. And it took me a year almost of mourning, having to sort of force myself to push those out. But it was a very, very good lesson. It's a lesson in
Sounds like an amputation.
No, to me, writing on some level is an act of humbling, continuously. That you don't choose to write. You write what you are capable of writing. You write what the book wants you to write. It's a very difficult thing to talk about this stuff because I'm worried about sounding too abstract about it, but that's how it feels, at least when I'm working.
Well, perhaps at this point we could listen to you read from Anatomy of a Disappearance, the second novel.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read a short introduction to the book. I don't normally do this, but these are thoughts that have presented themselves. Namely because Anatomy of a Disappearance was born, it was published in the middle of the Libyan revolution. So it was a very heated time, and the book was ushered into a space that I didn't feel was appropriate for it. Anyway, these are some thoughts. Given our history and in light of that record, it perhaps might not be too exuberant a statement to suggest that literature, together with her sister arts, is perhaps amongst the last places of freedom. Literature is, in fact, so intransigent in her freedom that it bars even her authors to dictate how the work is read. As such, a book is as much a child of its author and his circumstances as it is of its time. And there lies the curious relationship, at once accidental and fateful, between a book and its time. The matter is complicated further by the fact that neither time nor the book can stand still, which makes one wonder if a book, any book, is ever one book, but an endless multitude of books, each altered and made different by those who chance to read it, and also by the point in time in which they decide, for whatever reason, to plunge in. So even though we all might have read the same book, no two amongst us have read exactly the same book. I think these thoughts in relation to my last novel, Anatomy of a Disappearance, the novel I'm about to read from now. It is a book that was born in a loud time, a time full of urgencies and certainties of revolutions. Through a haphazard series of consequences, a book that was started years before, and like all books, I suspect, started in a moment of extreme privacy, when the idea of an Arab Spring was not even on the horizon, had the misfortune of being published in the midst of a civil war taking place in its author's country, a country from which the author had been exiled for some 3 decades. The book was innocent of the war, innocent of the revolution, and perhaps even innocent of its author. Its narrative is not about the author's country. None of its characters are Libyan. In fact, the word Libya does not appear on any of its pages. Yet the country and the war and the revolution pursued it everywhere it went. Once born, it was bathed and dressed up and taken not to a celebration with flowers and sugar-glazed almonds, but a political demonstration with blood on the ground, a place that demands that literature's function be either to subvert or to praise. My book was written with neither of these intentions. It's a book about love and grief, loss and memory, about time passing and the impossibility of knowing anyone, knowing them fully, and what that does to time and the nature of intimacy and desire. Ultimately, and from a practical point of view, it is a book written out of devotion. I'm just going to read from the beginning. I love this pre-Renaissance idea of a book being published without a title or the name of the author, and you write it for the shelf, to contribute to the shelf. So the book comes to you naked without a title at this moment, just right from the beginning. There are times when my father's absence is as heavy as a child sitting on my chest. Other times I can barely recall the exact features of his face and must bring out the photographs I keep in an old envelope in the drawer of my bedside table. There has not been a day since his sudden and mysterious vanishing that I have not been searching for him, looking in the most unlikely places. Everything and everyone, existence itself, has become an evocation, a possibility for resemblance. Perhaps this is what is meant by that brief and now almost archaic word, elegy. I do not see him in the mirror, but feel him adjusting, as if he were twisting within a shirt that nearly fits. My father has always been intimately mysterious, even when he was present. I can almost imagine how it might have been coming to him as an equal, as a friend, but not quite. My father disappeared in 1972, at the beginning of my school Christmas holiday when I was 14. Muna and I were staying at the Montreux Palace taking breakfast, I with my large glass of bright orange juice, and she with her steaming black tea on the terrace overlooking the steel blue surface of Lake Geneva, at the other end of which, beyond the hills and the bending waters, lay the now vacant city of Geneva. I was watching the silent paragliders hover above the still lake, and she was paging through La Tribune de Genève when suddenly her hand rose to her mouth and trembled. A few minutes later, we were aboard a train, hardly speaking, passing the newspaper back and forth. We collected from the police station the few belongings that were left on the bedside table. When I unsealed the small plastic bag, along with the tobacco and the lighter flint, I smelled him. That same watch is now wrapped around my wrist, and even today, after all these years, when I press the underside of the leather strap against my nostrils, I can detect a whiff of him. I wonder now how different my story would have been were Muna's hands unbeautiful, her fingertips coarse. I still, all of these years later, hear the same childish persistence. I saw her first, which bounced like a devil on my tongue whenever I caught one of Father's claiming gestures, his fingers sinking into her hair, his hand landing on her skirted thigh with the absent-mindedness of a man touching his earlobe in mid-sentence. He had taken to the Western habit of holding hands, kissing, embracing in public, but he could not fool me. Like a bad actor, he seemed unsure of his steps. Whenever he would catch me looking at him, he would look away, and I swear I could see color in his cheeks. A dark tenderness rises in me now as I think how hard he had tried, how I yearn still for an easy sympathy with my father. Our relationship lacked what I have always believed possible, given time, and perhaps after I had become a man, after he had seen me become a father, a kind of emotional eloquence and ease. But now the distances that had then governed our interactions and cut a quiet gap between us continue to shape him in my thoughts.
One of the really intriguing things about Anatomy of a Disappearance is, and of course this is a link that's been made before, is the relationship between your own experience and what you fictionalize as Nuri's experience in the novel. Rather than, get into the whole discussion of how much fiction is autobiography and so on and so forth, perhaps a more general question to you as a writer: where do you see the boundary lying between memory, between remembering and fictional imagining?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think one of the things that literature does, or at least one of the things that novels, I think, particularly do well, is that they illuminate dark spaces. They alight on silences. And the way that usually you do that is by engaging with some sort of knowledge that you have of the world. And I have experienced a very particular kind of loss that has sustained not only my thinking and sustained me emotionally and in all the obvious ways, but it's also sustained me intellectually. It's been interesting for me, notwithstanding all the difficulties. It's fascinating. If you are interested in being a human being and contemplating all of these various things that we all go through every day, then for a writer it's incredibly interesting to pause at. So I was interested in this kind of loss, a loss through disappearance, not a loss through death. Loss through death is devastating and terrible, but oftentimes we feel there's a finality to it. Even if we have faith about what might be here after this world, it's still abstract. The space that the beloved occupies is abstract. But disappearance is unique in that, the possibility of somebody existing at this particular moment under that same moon is a real one, and therefore it alters your experience of the lived moment, of how you eat your meal, how you bathe, how you dress. It alters these things. And putting aside my personal responses to that, as a writer, I found that interesting, and I thought how I could construct a narrative that would allow me to think about that and other things, including memory, including how, for example, and one of the things this book is interested in is how memory is not the static place. Memory is a very vibrant location, and we know it from our everyday lives that things that have happened long ago are altered by the present. Something that we went through that perhaps we didn't then think of very fondly. Now we look back at it fondly. So the present, I think, is always rewriting the past. And the past is always nudging the present in some way. And that's an interesting relationship to contemplate, I think.
I think it is. And I think there's something very capricious about memory as well, the way it moves. It tends not to move in straight lines. It tends to link things and go off at tangents and so on, and turn back on itself, right? And that was one of the things that also struck me about Anatomy of a Disappearance. And later on we'll also be talking about your forthcoming book, The Return, I believe is the title. And there again, perhaps even more clearly, there is this sort of non-linear temporal structure. But reading Anatomy, I wondered, was this because the subject matter called for it? Does it resist linear treatment? Right, the nature of the story that you're telling in that book, is that what it is? Is that why the narrative is not told, as it were, in a straight line, but does have there is, of course, a linear narrative, but there's a lot of moving back and forth in time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an undertow to it. It's as if, like, the moment you move forward, you're being pulled back a bit, and that seemed to work structurally for me. It makes it very tricky to write, but the whole point is that it's not tricky to read, hopefully, but it is tricky to write. That structure. And yes, and I think it does lend itself to all the what we're talking about, reflections, the presence of the past in the present.
Yeah. Let me shift slightly to something you actually mentioned explicitly in the introductory remarks you made before reading, which is that your characters in Anatomy of a Disappearance never mention Libya. Libya's never mentioned on any page. To be honest with you, after I'd finished reading it the first time, I thought, maybe it's mentioned. I kind of, went past it and missed it, right? But in fact, Nuri, who is the narrator, uses the expression "our country," which seems to have both connotations of ownership, of possession, right? Our country, but at the same time to be something so distant. It's almost an abstraction, our country, right? They're not in our country. Where is our country? So where is it?
Well, I mean, there are clues in the book that would give it away that they are from Iraq. But I didn't mention it because, I didn't explicitly mention it because it's almost neither here nor there, I feel. That they are a family like so many other Arabic families that had to escape and go, and Egypt was a center for a lot of people from Iraq, from Libya, from Palestine, and so on. So, and it's that sort of condition that I was more interested in than the specific, But if you were to look at, where was a monarch killed at that year, where did this, that would be the only place is Iraq. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so sorry if that gave the game away for those of you who didn't read the book. Exile, just to kind of go back to that. And do you mind if we talk a bit about the forthcoming book as well, The Return? I know that we're going to hear you read a bit from it, but maybe we can talk a bit about it before you do that. So an excerpt of this forthcoming book, which is a non-fiction work, right, appeared in the New Yorker some time ago. And you begin that excerpt with reflections on New York City, which you talk about as a place which means nothing and everything at the same time. And you say something really interesting, which is, this could be the city that represents the possibility of cheating yourself out of exile. How does one cheat oneself out of exile?
Well, you can't. I mean, I thought it was a very curious moment that I found myself, fate had it that I was living in the city, New York, where I was born, city I was born in, but I have absolutely no connections to. Not only that, but I am one of those very few people in the world that is not particularly attracted by New York. So I thought it was an interesting moment that I was there, and it was just immediately after I'd gone back to Libya after 33 years of not being able to go back to Libya. And that accident felt poignant on some level. So I mentioned New York, as you say, I mentioned it as a place that was sort of the fantasy of cheating yourself out of exile. I think in our modern times there's this myth that somehow we could choose our identity, we could choose our, future in some way. Part of that is very welcome, and it's a wonderful, liberating quality about, changing your career and doing something else, and all of that I think is fantastic. But it sometimes, I feel, almost dilutes a very important truth, which is that we are part of histories. We are born into histories. We are born into narratives. We are born into the story of our family, the story of our country. It doesn't mean that we have to go around defending it and being chauvinistic about it. In fact, the opposite. It means that we have to engage with it, robustly. And so cheating myself out of exile is not a possibility for me. So that's...
Well, I was reminded a bit, reading that, of Edward Said's famous essay, Reflections on Exile, right, in which he wonders why, well, he questions exile as this compelling motif in our culture. And he says, ours is the age of the refugee, the displaced person, mass migration. And of course, these are not quite the same as the exile in the classical sense of the word, but nevertheless, they come close. And I think in the context in which we're holding this conversation, it's worth pointing out that the Mediterranean is now a central arena in which these dramas are being played out on a day-to-day basis. But I thought of Said and his essay and so on because I wondered if literally, if the act of writing, if the act of narrating becomes a way of dealing with the brute fact, as Said puts it, the unbearably historical fact of exile, is writing a way to deal with it, not resolve it, not really cheat oneself out of it, but somehow deal with it.
I'm not sure what deal with it means. I think I know what you mean, that in a sense you sort of cure it or reduce its potency on you, or is that, is that what you mean by deal with it?
Well, that could be one
Yeah.
meaning. Another could be to render the condition, as it were, productive.
Yes.
Put it to
Yeah.
use,
Yeah.
harness it in a creative way.
Certainly not consciously. I mean, I do think, in that essay, Edward Said says something along the lines of exile being a jealous state, meaning that
Yes.
everything that you've gleaned from it has been painfully earned, and therefore you don't want to share it, straight away. So it's a jealous state in that sense. And maybe writing is an antidote to that, because there is something, notwithstanding all of the things that people say about writing, that, you have to be selfish, you have to lock yourself in a room, you have to be very disciplined, you have to let go of a lot of things to write these books. It's not particularly healthy, all of these things. Yet, bizarrely, and I don't have any way to justify it or prove it, but it certainly doesn't feel selfish in the doing of it. It's almost the opposite of that. It feels a very, very generous enterprise, at the risk of me calling myself generous. I'm not saying that, but the work itself, and certainly as a reader, this is the feeling I get when I read. We oftentimes say people read, we read in order to learn about, when you're young, they tell you read books so you can learn about other countries and other people. And that's true, but more often than not, the really magical moments in reading, at least for me, are moments of recognition. They're moments, where, so in a sense, I think we read, yes, to know about other countries and other people and so on, but we also read to find ourselves. We read to locate ourselves in these narratives. Those magical moments when you read something and you think, oh yes, I've always felt that, but I've never had words for it, And that's such an enlivening enterprise. This is why I said what I said early on about, how moved I am always when I see people supporting literature and working for literature, because, it is not this middle class, comfortable thing that you do. You pick up a book and you sit in a big comfortable armchair and you wallow away the hours, There is, of course, that to it too. Entertainment is a lovely quality of literature. But more often than not, literature is a way of engaging us almost into the subterranean network of what it means to be a human being. It engages you into all of the deep passions, all the deep ideas, and it goes back and forwards. It's a wonderful, wonderful enterprise, and it's very difficult to imagine, any state of progress without it.
You decided to take up this enterprise of writing in English, and English was not your first language. You grew up in an Arabic-speaking environment, and you learned English later on, right, after moving to Egypt. We were just talking about it a few minutes ago, actually. But what was the reason why you decided to then begin to write? When you began to write, what made you write in English rather than in any of the other languages that are accessible to you? Arabic, for example.
I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, I have an answer, which is a practical answer, meaning that it was, when I started writing, English was my stronger language. My education has been in English since I've been 12 years old. So when I came to write, it was the language that is the strongest. It's not a subject that sits easily with me. I was joking, and like all jokes, there's always a grain of truth in it. I was joking with my friend and shipmate, Mu'izz, whom we've heard read earlier, who writes in French. And when he said that he wrote in French, I told him, yes, also, you're like me, another traitor, you know? And it does feel like somehow you've betrayed something. So it doesn't sit comfortably. But I am an English language writer, meaning that my sense of language, the excitement that I get from reading a good line, I get it from Arabic too, but my ear is far more sophisticated with English. My sense of the syntax, of the rhythm, of the meaning, of the shadows of meaning in the language are just stronger there. Why does it feel like a betrayal? Maybe, I don't know all the answers to it, but maybe because when we write in a language, we write in the river of the language. You know, it's not just that you're writing in another language, you're writing into and back into a tradition. I remember the late Naguib Mahfouz, once I asked him, I said to him, what do you make of people like me who write in other languages? And he said to me, oh, so you belong to the language that you write in. And it was hard for me to hear that when I was very young, when I asked him this, but it's true. It's true. And there's a complexity about that can't be easily settled by saying something glib like, I'm the insider wanting to blow up the palace or something. You know, all of these things aren't satisfying to me.
One final question before we maybe can hear you read from the forthcoming book. This is a question of a slightly more political nature. You were saying, again in your introduction before the reading, that Anatomy of a Disappearance, inevitably, in a sense, you were suggesting, I think, had to be read as a book that came out during the revolution, but it was not written with that in mind. The Return, on the other hand, seems to, at least the passages of it that I've had access to, seems to be quite explicitly about the revolution. But I'd like to hear your own thoughts about Libya now and where you think it's going. This question was provoked partly because shortly after the revolution there was a piece, a very long essay actually, by Hugh Roberts in the London Review of Books. The title says it all. It was, who said Gaddafi had to go? And you responded to that, and you said, Roberts succeeds in expressing no sympathy for, let alone solidarity with, a people's legitimate aspiration for justice and freedom. The Return deals with those aspirations, but also the lingering fear that these aspirations may turn out to be disappointments. Where do you see Libya heading now in the current situation? What's going on?
Well, that's a big question. There's a real sense, if I could convey a little bit of what at least I am feeling and the Libyans that I know are feeling, because I don't like generalizations, and my compatriots are, like most people, given to generalizations. So I want to keep it specific. There's a real sense of horror and disappointment. And I think something existentially is deeply shaken inside of us when we see our own butcher and be butchered by our own. Civil wars are a nightmare that is also a very private nightmare. Every one of us experiences it differently. There isn't a morning when I wake up when I don't for a flash think, oh, it's a bad dream. It's all a bad dream. And then I realize, no, it's not actually. It's not a dream. It's reality. So it's given how short the time we have is, it makes it even more impossible for me to convey the depth of sadness and horror and disappointment and pain that we are feeling. This, however, poses certain risks to us. And the risks are to have a knee-jerk reaction. You know, it's a bit, and I'm sorry to give such a poor pedestrian example, but it's a bit like, you know, when you and your friends are you're very hungry, you're starving, and you just want to go and get lunch, and you just stop at the quickest restaurant, and you have a terrible meal, awful meal. You come away and you think, oh, you know, the problem was that we were hungry. No, the problem isn't that you were hungry. The problem is that the restaurant wasn't the right restaurant. You know, our yearnings for freedom, for justice, for dignity, for the rule of law were sincere. Those cannot be questioned. Revolutions, they extend back. Their memories, the memory of a revolution is far longer than the memory of the protagonists. It goes much further back. It's a response. It's not some easy march through solid gates of freedom and justice. It's a disruptive process. It's a process of balancing hopes and hungers, which is why this is the paradox, is that I found myself thrown into a revolution, and I am maybe the least revolutionary person you would ever meet. Since I was a kid, I never found revolutions romantic. I've never liked revolutions. They're not an ideal way of changing things. They demand too much certainty. They don't allow for enough doubt. They demand too much noise and violence. But we were brought to a place where we had no other option, and it happened very organically. And it took us. We've made the leap, and the leap now has consequences, and we are embedded and implicated into this leap. I say all of this because I feel that whenever somebody says, Libyans included, oh, you see now, wasn't it better before? Which is a normal response given how awful things are. But the question is so inappropriately confused. It's a bit like somebody who walks by, say here, this beautiful building. Imagine this building is on fire. It's burning. The stones are burning. And everybody around Malta starts to think the building is burning. But the burning just keeps going. There's nothing that's done about it. Eventually, people start to think, well, you know, it's sort of like a landmark now, the burning of the building. It's like this light that's just burning all the time. People get used to it. Then one day the burning stops. And you walk by the building and it's all black, and you think, you know what? I really preferred it when it was burning. I don't like it now that it's all black. So Libya is a bit like that. It was burning before. All of the things that you're seeing now, there are seeds that have been planted, not only, you know, chiefly by the dictatorship, but also, you know, one doesn't want to abstract things and just, you know, make it all about the dictatorship. But it's very difficult to convey to what extent the Libyan dictatorship managed to extend its tentacles into every aspect of life, including education. And so where do I see Libya now? I see Libya caught up in a great conflict where sadly the present leadership on both sides lacks all of the necessary things for compromise, for discourse, for sitting down and talking to each other. It's the time for revenge, and it's the time of guns. It's not the time for talking. And history shows that once you get to this place, two things have to happen for things to stop. You have to have better leadership, and sadly, if you don't have that, you're just going to have to wait till people get tired. The country's tired, but the people fighting aren't yet quite exhausted. And that's a very frightening prospect.
Perhaps this would be a good time to hear an excerpt from Libertarian.
Sure.
And then we'll close there. Yeah.
I'm going to read a short passages really from my new book, which is a non-fiction book called The Return, and it's sort of an account of my engagement with politics, history, art, literature, architecture, and it was provoked by my return to Libya. My father was a political prisoner and disappeared, as we have sadly a number of Libyan political prisoners who have disappeared in Gaddafi's prison. So we still don't know where he is. It's obvious that he's dead, but we don't know exactly where he is. And so the return was also an attempt for me to try to find out what might have happened to him. So I'll read 3 very short, really paragraphs. The first one is the beginning of the book, because I always think it's useful to tonally get the beginning of the book. And the other 2, at the risk of misrepresenting my book, they are reflections. Early morning, March 2012. My mother, my wife Diana, and I were sitting in a row of seats that were bolted to the tiled floor of a lounge in Cairo International Airport. Flight 835 for Benghazi, a voice announced, was due to depart on time. Every now and then, my mother glanced anxiously at me. Diana, too, seemed concerned. She placed a hand on my arm and smiled. I should get up and walk around, I told myself, but my body remained rigid. I had never felt more capable of stillness. The terminal was nearly empty. There was only one man sitting in the row of seats facing us. He was overweight, weary-looking, possibly in his mid-50s. There was something in the way he sat, the locked hands on the lap, the left tilt of the torso, that signaled resignation. Was he Egyptian or Libyan? Was he on a visit to the neighboring country or going home after the revolution? Had he been for or against Gaddafi? Perhaps he was one of those undecided ones who held their reservations close to their chest. The voice of the announcer returned. I hear our flight number again. It was ready for boarding. I found myself standing at the front of the line, Diana beside me. She had, on more than one occasion, taken me to the town where she was born in Northern California. I know the plants and the color of the light and the distances where she grew up. Now I was, finally, taking her to my land. She had packed the Hasselblad and the Leica, her 2 favorite cameras, and 100 rolls of film. Diana works with great fidelity. Once she gets hold of a thread, she will follow it until the end. Knowing this excited and worried me. I'm reluctant to give Libya any more than it has already taken. Mother was pacing by the windows that looked onto the runway, speaking on her mobile phone. People, mostly men, began to fill the terminal. Diana and I were now standing at the head of a long line. It bent behind us like a river. I pretended I had forgotten something and pulled her to one side. Returning after all these years was a bad idea, I suddenly thought. My family had left in 1979, 33 years earlier. This was the chasm that divided the man from the 8-year-old boy I was when my family left. The plane was going to cross that gulf. Surely such journeys were reckless. This one could rob me of a skill that I have worked hard to cultivate, how to live away from places and people I love. Joseph Brodsky was right, so were Nabokov and Conrad. They were artists who never returned. Each had tried, in his own way, to cure himself of his country. What you have left behind has dissolved. Return and you will face the absence or the defacement of what you treasured. But Dmitry Shostakovich and Boris Pasternak and Naguib Mahfouz were also right. Never leave the homeland. Leave and your connections to the source will be severed. You will be like a dead trunk, hard and hollow. What do you do when you cannot leave and cannot return? And this is from further into the book, reflection. The country that separates fathers and sons has disorientated many travelers. It is very easy to get lost here. Telemachus, Edgar, Hamlet, and countless other sons, their private dramas ticking away in the silent hours, have sailed so far out into the uncertain distance between past and future that they seem adrift. They are men, like all men, who have come into the world through another man, a sponsor, opening the gate and, if they are lucky, doing so gently, perhaps with a reassuring smile and an encouraging nudge on the shoulder. And the fathers must have known, for having once themselves been sons, that the ghostly presence of their hand on the shoulder will remain throughout the years, to the end of time, and that no matter what burdens are laid on that shoulder, or the number of kisses a lover plants there, perhaps knowingly driven by the secret wish to erase the claim of another, the shoulder will remain forever faithful, remembering that good man's hand that had ushered them into the world. To be a man is to be part of this chain of gratitude and remembering, of blame and forgetting, of surrender and rebellion, until a son's gaze is made so wounded and keen that on looking back he sees nothing but shadows. With every passing day, the father journeys further into his night, deeper into the fog, leaving behind remnants of himself and the monumental yet obvious fact, at once frustrating and merciful, for how else is the son to continue living if he must not also forget, that no matter how hard we try, we can never entirely know our fathers. And this is the last passage. The possibility of my father having died in the infamous massacre that happened in 1996 in the political prison Abu Slim is a very high possibility because he was in that prison. So this refers to that. The first signs that something horrible had occurred inside the walls of Abu Slim did not surface until several years after the massacre. Small scraps of information began to emerge, each incomplete, as if careful not to reveal the whole picture at once. I heard the stories and registered them perhaps the way we all, from within our detailed lives, perceive facts. That is, not perceive them at all until they have been repeated countless times and, even then, understand them only partially. So much information is lost that every small loss provokes inexplicable grief. Power must know this. Power must know how fatigued human nature is, and how unready we are to listen, and how willing we are to settle for lies. Power must know that, ultimately, we would rather not know. Power must believe, given how things proceed, that the world was better made for the perpetrator than those who arrive after the fact, seeking justice or accountability or truth. Power must see such attempts as pathetic, and yet the bereaved, the witness, the investigator, and the chronicler cannot but try to make reason of the diabolical mess, each motivated by his or her own need or idea or obsession. They rush this way and that like ants after a picnic, attending to the crumbs, and time rolls on, infinitely duplicating the distances, furthering us from the original event, making it less possible with every passing day to account for what exactly happened, or to be certain, indeed, that anything had happened at all. Yet also, with every folding year, like the line of a step mimicking the one before it, it becomes equally impossible to escape, to give up altogether on what has been invested so far, not least of all, the person swallowed up by the injustice. Eventually, the original loss, the point of departure, the point from which life changed irrevocably, comes to resemble a living presence, having its own force and temperament. Like desire, its vitality is in what it withholds, until attachment and resentment are so closely intertwined that it is difficult at times to distinguish one from the other.
Hisham Matar.